You don't stumble upon an abandoned tank every day, but there are actually a lot more of them than you might think. They're also in places where you would not expect them. At Flamenco Beach on the island of Culebra in Puerto Rico, for example, you can see the remains of an old M4 Sherman tank that doesn't really fit into the paradisical nature there. It was used on the island for training and testing purposes and then simply left behind. Many of the machines and weapons that were brought there in the early 1970s were later taken back by the military, but some of the heavier tanks were not so easy to move away. The salty sea air and the moisture hurt the metal badly. Locals have at least spruced up the rusty tank by painting over its shell over and over again, which makes it look a little friendlier. Nowadays, this Sherman is a well-known attraction on the otherwise pristine beach. Another M4A3 105 HVSS Sherman can also be found on the island of Culebra and not far from the other tank on Flamenco Beach. The US Navy simply left it standing in the sand in 1975 after abandoning the training site due to protests from local people. The sea air has damaged this tank too, and just like the other Sherman, it is regularly sprayed with graffiti and therefore always looks a little different. Despite the past as a training ground, the beach where the tanks are located is always rated highly and seems to be very popular. In a completely different setting sits Stompy, London's own T-34 medium tank. You can find it in a parking lot on Mandela Way in Bermondsey, wrapped in art or political statements. The tank originally came from Prague, but after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was then resold along with other military stocks. In 1995, the British film director Richard Loncraine needed a tank for the film Richard III, and this T-34 was just right for him. After the filming, the machine was sold to the military enthusiast and real estate dealer Russell Gray for just £7,000 as a birthday present for his 7-year-old son. Rumor has it that McGray only did this because he was upset that he was not allowed to build a house on the property where the tank is now sitting and wanted to get back at the local council. After more than 20 years, Stompy is still in place, but always in a different design. These tanks, on the other hand, offer a completely different picture and show a post-apocalyptic backdrop in which nature triumphs over technology after people have disappeared. The tanks are in the Fort Knox military base in Kentucky and are slowly being swallowed by the earth. Plants are now growing over the metal plates and large parts of the machine are no longer visible. Without the protruding cannon barrels, you could easily overlook the tanks completely. Also difficult to see from a distance is this Japanese tank, which lies at a depth of 50 meters on the wreck of the San Francisco Maru, a transporter of the Japanese Navy which was sunk in Chuuk near the Federated States of Micronesia during World War II. The shell is now completely overgrown with corals and for this reason hardly stands out from the surroundings. Together with the shipwreck and all the other machines and objects that sank back then, the tank offers marine animals a home and delivers an exciting place to explore. Nearby is the Nippu Maru, submerged in the sea, with 2 Type 95 tanks on top of it, which have now adapted quite well to their new location. The Chuuk Atoll is a real treasure room for such finds because there are numerous ships here, mostly at a depth of 20 to 50 meters, so easily accessible for divers. In this picture, you can see a number of Japanese Type 95 tanks known as Ha-Go. This light tank weighed only 7.4 tons, but it proved to be extremely effective and was very popular with the crews. Today, the metal shells just vegetate somewhere in the South Pacific and are overgrown by plants because the vehicles are no longer used. As with so many tanks, haulage and scrapping are too expensive and they just get left behind, sitting around in the middle of nowhere. That could also be the fate of this tank in Israel, which lies abandoned on the Golan Heights and is visited by a few curious horses. It was probably used in a major battle in the Valley of Tears almost 50 years ago and has not been moved since. The huge steel pile doesn't seem to bother the horses much at all. Some of the most famous abandoned tanks are undoubtedly found on Shikotan. The island is claimed by both the Russian Federation and Japan. The disagreement over ownership goes back many years, and in the 1950s and 60s, the Soviet Union fortified the entire island in case of a Japanese invasion. Many older tanks were converted into coastal artillery, buried in the ground, and thus made into stationary weapons. Transporting heavy tanks that are still buried is, of course, not an easy task. Therefore, the meanwhile rusty and useless fortifications can still be found in many places on Shikotan. Of course, these tanks are absolutely useless for combat because they are just as effective as 40 tons of paperweights. But at least they provide a cool motive for a photo between the bright green of the plants. On the other hand, this old tank on the Solomon Islands in the South Pacific is less prominent. Due to the lively plant life in the rainforest, the M2 Stuart, which is now heavily overgrown by moss, can hardly be recognized. Leaves now grow where they used to be grenades. 70 years ago, the M2 Stuart was one of the best light tanks and played an important role in the advancement of military vehicles. But after so many years alone on a bay in a small island, one can assume that nobody will come to save this tank. These Soviet T-34s, both of which were abandoned south of Vladivostok, can be seen from afar because nothing is growing on their rusty hulls. But the contrast of green, the red of the rusted tanks, and the sky over Zeltikin Island in the Sea of Japan is really nice. There are also many other T-34 tanks on the island, as they were brought there for target practice in the 80s. In the meantime, they've become a small tourist attraction, and many people come to the island to see the old tanks. A few years ago, 2 of the tanks were repaired for a project and were then even able to drive independently. And in 2013, someone painted the tanks on the island in bright colors, which made them look like giant toys. But this Japanese Type 97 tank, known as Chiha, has it even better, as it is beautifully sitting in a flower field on the island of Shumshu. This is the northernmost island of the Kuriles, and one of the last tank battles of World War II took place here. That is why you can find a number of armored vehicles here that were not taken away after the battle, but simply catalogued and abandoned. In fact, the whole island has been left to its own fate, and only recently have scientific expeditions and tourists in search of interesting remains started to visit all the wrecks. This picture shows an M108 self-propelled howitzer that got stuck in a swamp in Belgium. It's hard to say what exactly happened here and why nobody bothered to save the machine. Perhaps it was time to replace the howitzer anyway, and the people in charge didn't think the old machine was worth the amount of money it would take to get it out of the swamp. After all, the 90 units of this type were only used by Belgium until the 1980s. Sometimes, older tanks are brought out of such situations with a lot of effort, which can be seen in the example of this KV-1 tank from World War II. The heavy tank sunk in a swamp in Vitebsk, a region in Belarus. The struggle to get the vehicle out of the swamp took several days because it was 3 meters deep underwater. The plan is to turn the old tank into a museum piece. This American Sherman M4 had to wait more than 70 years to be salvaged after it went down with the Thomas Donaldson, a transport ship that was hit by a torpedo during World War II. The tank, along with other equipment on the ship, was supposed to support the Soviets in their fight against the German Empire. The now extremely rusty Sherman was flown from Murmansk to Vladivostok and restored because it was supposed to take part in a military parade. The aim was to honor the cooperation with the West during the war. In some places, abandoned tanks have been part of the environment for so long that people no longer notice them, which you can see quite well in this picture. In the background, people go about their business without bothering about the abandoned T-34-85, which has probably been in the city of Kwamba in Mozambique for a long time. This tank cemetery in Ukraine paints a completely different picture. The sparsely guarded junkyard houses hundreds of tanks from the Soviet era, carefully lined up. In the past, this large space was used to bring up to 60 tanks a month back into shape, including many T-64 and T-72 models. However, what the photographer Pavel Itkin found in the small town of Kharkiv near the Russian border was more akin to a graveyard than an active workshop. This US Army depot in Sierra Nevada is even more impressive. Technically, we don't have a tank graveyard here, but many of the neatly lined up vehicles that seem to stretch to the horizon have been abandoned to save money. Some of them are still in excellent condition, but if they're not needed, the vehicles have to be stored somewhere, and the dry area offers a lot of space and good conditions to maintain them for many years. It's also pretty dry here in Eritrea's tank graveyard, but instead of being neatly lined up, the rusty tanks are piled on top of each other with other scrap. These broken steel monsters are not far from the country's capital, Asmara, and are reminiscent of the country's struggles for independence. In the famous Plain of Jars in Laos, you can find hundreds of stone jars that were either used for wine production or as burial urns, as well as an abandoned tank. The decades-old tank is in a worse condition than many of the 2,000-year-old stone jars for which this place is known. Incidentally, these vessels weigh up to 6 tons, which is almost as much as some of the light tanks, for example, the Type 95 that we have seen before. So those were a few of the abandoned tanks that can be found in different places around the world. There are countless more in many unusual places, which really surprised me. But as already mentioned several times, it is probably very expensive and cumbersome to transport these vehicles and scrap them. Well, I hope you liked this video. See you next time. Bye!